one thing we've done is to reinforce our values in as many ways as possible. Many companies say that their values are really important to them, but then you ask, like, how many ways do you have to reinforce them? At GitLab, we have 22 ways to reinforce our values, from really essential ones, like how we hire, how we give performance bonuses, to really trivial ones, that the songs in the GitLab songbook reference our values a lot.
Today on the Eric Ries Show, I sit down with Sid Sijbrandij, co-founder of GitLab. If you're a programmer, you know them already, and if not, ask a developer. They are a DevOps platform used by over 30 million people. And yet another incredible overnight success many years in the making. Sid is one of the most original thinkers in the technology industry. Before building a public company, his career began in one of the most unexpected places, building submarines in the Netherlands. From there, he taught himself to code and eventually joined forces with GitLab's open source creator to build something radically different. In this conversation, Sid opens up about how GitLab maintains its unconventional ethos. Things like radical transparency, remote work from before the pandemic, and open source collaboration. You'll hear the whole story from a Hacker News side project to his successful IPO, about the many acquisition offers he turned down, how they've built the company in this unusual way, and most importantly, how a 2,000-page public handbook has become their superpower for scaling trust, alignment, and decentralized decision-making. The handbook is such a great example of what I've called in these episodes a leader's guide, a way to institutionalize the intention behind a company's ethos. This is one of the best examples you'll ever see. If you care about building enduring companies with values that actually hold up under pressure, this episode is not to be missed. Here's my conversation with Sid Sijbrandij. Thank you so much, Sid, for doing this.
You are very welcome. Thanks for having me.
I've wanted to have this conversation for a long time. Our recent people who have been following the podcast know we just did an episode with Matt Mullenweg. And when I asked him who was the number one person we should talk to, yours name was the very first one that he talked about. And he said that so many of the things that they pioneered at WordPress, he felt like you had taken, I don't even think he said to the next level, but he used a more extreme adjective than that, like really taking it really far, that he was really proud of what you had done. And so it got me really hyped for this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And he's been a big inspiration in the way he kept all the code open source and the way he built a completely remote company were really amazing and really inspirational to us.
So let's start with your background and just how did GitLab come to be?
Started in 2011. My co-founder, what later turned out to be my co-founder, Dimitri, had a need for GitLab himself. And his company wouldn't pay for anything. So he said, well, how hard can it be? I'll just make it myself. And in that first year, 300 people contributed to it. He published it online and people started using it and gave back to it. I saw it a year later. I thought, this is awesome. Did a show Hacker News and said, hey, if you don't want to download GitLab, just want to use it as a service, I'll make a place for that. Are people interested? And it didn't trend, and I was very sad. And then went on to bake pancakes. And then I checked my phone one more time, and I said to my wife, oh my goodness, I'm number one on the Hacker News homepage. I got to go upstairs and go talk to people. 300 people signed up for the beta, and we launched a couple later. And we got amazing demand, except people didn't want to pay us for hosting GitLab. But they did host GitLab themselves. And these were like Fortune 1 companies doing that. And started catering to that. And a year later, I hired Dimitri, and we formed a company together.
So what did GitLab do in those days? Like, what was the MVP for GitLab?
The MVP was making sure you could do source control on source code. With Git, there was a new revolutionary technology for that, and GitLab was a way to have a web interface to that. And software rules everything around us, and it's super important to be able to contribute to that, to suggest a change, to review those. Over time, it added more and more functionality, where today GitLab is a DevOps platform. You can go all the way from planning what you want to build it, check it, make sure it's secure, deploy it, monitor what you've done, and do that entire software improvement loop all within one application.
I think I remember reading that you had like interned at Procter and Gamble and at IBM, at like some like really big, iconic American companies. Is that right?
Yeah, that was super fun and super inspiring, also a little bit intimidating for me. And I learned a lot. I think the difficult decision afterwards was where to go work. And I remember that IBM made a job offer, and I said I would take another job. And they said, "Oh my goodness, not Microsoft, we hope." And I said, "No, I'm going to build submarines." They were like, "Okay, that's fine as long as it's not Microsoft." And that was a very difficult decision. I had to. I was attracted to strategy consulting, maybe working for a Bain or a McKinsey. I had the job offer from IBM, but I also went to a boat fair, and there I saw a submarine, and I was just so intrigued. And I made what every management science person is supposed to do, made a balanced scorecard of how I should choose, and then I manipulated that long enough for the submarine to win. And I introduced the factor.
What kind of criteria did you have to invent to make the submarine the more logical career choice?
Exactly. Well, I had to invent one. It was the good story factor. My reasoning was I got to tell everyone what I do, and I want it to be a really good story. And I showed it to my dad. He said, "That's a ridiculous way to plan a career." And then many years later, my dad came back and said, about that good story factor, I tell every single person I meet what you do. It's so cool. It is actually maybe an okay criteria to decide.
I love that. I love the story factor as a career guide. Not so much because having a great story is valuable in itself, but I think it's such a great way to get yourself out of the like spreadsheet trap that people get into, where it just seems like I have to go work at this big company because that's the safe choice, the financially prudent choice, or whatever. And first of all, I know so many people who've been laid off from mega companies like that, and or like the company collapses or there's some kind of scandal, and it's like it wasn't even the safe choice after all. And meanwhile, they missed out on their opportunity to do what they really cared about.
Yeah, it was a good story also because it's interesting and not every day, and it attracted both good people who worked there. It also attracted bad people who we ended up getting scammed by a local supplier, and it made for a very, very fast rate of learning, both about business and about making a product, but also learning all the things that are wrong with yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Ahrefs. If you run a website, I'm sure you check your traffic. Heck, I remember when Google Analytics first came out. It was an incredible advance. But these days, we have worries about privacy, about how bloated it's become and how delayed the data is. Ahrefs Web Analytics is a free, privacy-first alternative built for simplicity and speed. We're talking about instant insights on website traffic, top pages, where visitors come from, and what devices they're using. No cookies by default, no personal data collected, just the essentials without the noise. Skip the complexity, respect your customer's privacy, and still know exactly what's happening in real time. Get instant website traffic and sign up for free at ahrefs.com/web-analytics. That's ahrefs.com/web-analytics. So I think for people who don't know the story already, explain what are we talking about with the submarine? What do you mean you went to work at a submarine company? Like give us some context.
Well, there was one problem. There was no company. I've just went to a boat fair with my wife, and we saw a prototype submarine there. And it was this inventor from Canada who made it, and an investor from the Netherlands who had dreamt about submarines ever since reading about it in comic books in the 80s. But this investor made money in software, and he was now ready to realize his dream. But apart from the inventor, there were no people. So I kept phoning him up and saying, "Hey, come on, you need people to run this. I'm people, hire me." To the point where IBM said, "You got to decide right now." I remember calling him. He was in China. It was going to be a short conversation, and he said, Okay, I'll hire you. You've been so persistent. What do you want to earn?" And I said something completely reasonable, and he said, "Half that." And I'm like, "Oh, goodness, what is my BATNA? Like, what's my best alternative?" And I was working for IBM, and I didn't want to do that. So I just said yes to the offer. I should have asked, why do you offer that? Because he was negotiating with a salary he remembered from 10 years ago. When was the last time he ever did a salary?
Oh my goodness. He didn't even know what he was asking.
And it caused me having to move him back with my parents. So I moved him back in my parents' attic, and I incorporated the company and started working for it. And luckily hired a friend from a university that was much smarter than me that became the general manager. And I tried to run the business operations and the electrical systems of the submarine.
And how did it turn out?
It turned out with lots of ups and downs and a lot of adventure. It turned out 5 years later, it was a steady company. 15 people worked there. We made the most submersibles in the world. And today the company still exists. U-Boat works in the Netherlands.
That's super cool. But then you'd had this like software opportunity to do stuff at IBM. You just really turned your back on that to do business operations and electrical engineering and like to get really into the most physical of products. How did you wind up back in software after that?
In my last year at the submarine company, I saw this new programming language called Ruby. And I read the code, and it just looked so much better than whatever I've seen before. I've seen Java code before. I've seen C code before. And just reading the first 5 lines of such a program just made me just feel a little bit miserable inside. Instead, this Ruby in comparison was like poetry. So I was like, okay, maybe it's time to finally learn how to program. And I bought a book and read it and got about 20%, and read it again. I got about 50%, and read it again. I got about 80%. And I thought, okay, well, I'm ready, and managed to become a kind of a consultant, and started with an extremely low hourly rate because I was extremely not good at what I did. But you got to start somewhere, and over time, I became more proficient.
You talked about the things you admired about Matt Mullenweg, the remote culture, open source. GitLab, like WordPress, has been really different. I feel like you're kind of been beating to the march of your own drummer for a long time. I guess my first question is why? Like, why was it important to you to do things differently?
It's not. In fact, one of our values at GitLab is boring solutions. Please don't reinvent the wheel. Please do whatever is common out there. So only deviate from standard if there's a compelling reason. So we're not afraid to be different, but you certainly have to have a good case for it, because otherwise it makes much more sense to do what everybody else is doing.
So when you started, did you think you were just going to do a conventional company? Like, what were your thoughts about it? You know, you're having all this success on Hacker News, but that's more about people like your product. When did you start thinking about GitLab as a company, and what kind of company you wanted to make?
From the start, I wanted it to be a company. And a few years in, it was doing okay. And we got an offer to buy the company for $10 million. And it was just owned by Dimitri and I. And I had 2 advisors, my accountant and my dad. And both said, you should definitely sell, because this is like life-changing money. You'll never have to work again. And I'm like, wow, I really like working, so I don't mind working. And I think we can do better. And then another big game changer was Y Combinator. We applied to Y Combinator at the end of that year. And I remember saying to my wife, like, hey, there's only a 1% chance, but if we get in, I'll have to move to the US for 3 months. And she's like, okay, this has been your lifelong dream. It's okay. You can apply. I think you'll get in, and I'll move with you, which she did. And, there we were determined to reduce the risk, like no VC money, don't take any investments, don't give out any stock. Just Dimitri and I owning the company and growing to 50 people in 5 years. That was the plan. And I even told my wife, like, stop me if I do anything else.
Why was that important to you?
I wanted this was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. I didn't want to mess it up. Like, It's nice to have a really big company, but have for the impact in your life, it doesn't matter that much whether it's a $100 million or a $10 billion company, as long as the downside is protected. And if you start taking VC money, there's a lot of downside risk. Like the outcome might be 10x bigger, but the odds of it failing are also 10 times bigger. So I convinced myself of that, but then we come to Silicon Valley and it's like
I was going to ask
if
you're trying not to raise venture money, what are you doing in Y Combinator?
Yeah, well, you can join Y Combinator without committing to raising venture money.
But most people that go to Y Combinator do it because they think it will accelerate their access to venture money.
Yeah, well, we certainly, if you don't want to raise any venture money, it's still helpful to do Y Combinator. You learn so much, you meet so many great people. It's totally worth it. But then we wanted to hire great people, and we said, hey, there's no stock options. Because we learned one thing, we saw a company that offered stock options, but then 10, 15 years later, they were still not able to cash out. And all these people were very disappointed. The deal is, if you give stock options, you got to try to make it worth something in 10 years. So we didn't offer any, and we couldn't hire any decent people because everyone was like, look, I'm here for a reason. The stock options is what makes people do really well here. So I'm not going to do it without stock options. And my expectation is that in 10 years, I'll have that ticket, and the lottery ticket might be worth something or nothing, but I'm not going to forgo it. The other thing was I really love Silicon Valley and the people there. And at Y Combinator, they said, hey, in our batch are 113 companies. 3 of you will become billion-dollar companies. And if we knew which 3, we'd have 3 companies here. In other words, don't even stay in Silicon Valley if you don't aspire to become a billion-dollar company and try to go for an IPO. So like, if you don't have that ambition, you better leave. And I wanted to stay, and I wanted to hire great managers as well. And then we're like, okay, so if in 10 years we need to cash out all the people who worked at us, either we sell the company or we IPO. And then the conclusion was we got to IPO because we don't want to lose the company.
I think that's really interesting because so far, the story you're telling, I know so many companies that have lived the experience that you're describing, and they come out of that experience very conventional. They start out being like, we're going to do things differently. We're not going to raise money. We're not going to go public. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And pretty much by the end of that process, the gravitational influence of all that money drags them into a very cookie cutter type situation. And I know quite a few of those founders who are totally miserable, even though they've made plenty of money, because the thing that they created at the end of the day, it's like a monster. It's like Frankenstein's monster that they don't really control. So I'm really curious. I want to probe on this a little bit. Like, how did you go through the beginnings of that story and yet still wind up, and even as you say, having a value of doing things the standard way when it makes sense, and nonetheless have a company that has such a reputation for being different?
You mentioned control. Very early, we recognized that the earlier you implement the controls, the easier it is. If you do it that really late in the process, let's say just before IPO, there's going to be tremendous pressure on you. So, for example, we have stock that votes 10 times as much. And in GitLab's case, it's granted to, in the end, first it was only founders, but in the end, we granted it to all the existing stockholders. But it does mean there's more control over the company. We did that very early, and that paid off.
You surely must have had lawyers and other people tell you it was too early to do stuff like that. I hear that all the time. Yeah. People get talked out of it.
Sometimes they say like, oh, it's not necessary now. We can do it later. I think, yeah, you can do it later, but it gets more difficult because you have more shareholders, more people bought into the company. And a way of thinking about it, it slightly reduces the value to other people. So you don't want to be taking away people's value, and the more people there are to convince, the harder that is. So
yeah. One of my favorite sayings is that it's always too early until it's too late.
Yep.
I'm always trying to get people to take control more seriously and to implement things more aggressively, sooner in their life. What else did you guys do to try to maintain control of the company?
I think the biggest thing, it might be obvious to people, but it's to fulfill, to to fulfill your promises to shareholders. You can have all the paperwork in the world. If the company's not doing well, you're not going to be in control of it. That's the most important thing. And one thing we recognized is that if we don't get to IPO quickly, investors get impatient and you're much more likely to be acquired at that time. So I said, okay, a typical VC fund is like 7 years plus maybe 3 years of extensions. But I said, okay, let's just aim to IPO in 7 years. I also checked with Dimitri, like, what's your commitment? And he said, 10 years. I'm like, oh, that's great. So we got the 7 years. It's like, no, 10 years from the start of the project. And that was 2011. I'm like, you mean 2021? He's like, yes. Like, oh, darn. And I want to complete this journey with you. So we got an IPO kind of a year earlier. So we said, okay, we have 5 years. It's 2020, we got an IPO. And the most important thing is to kind of make sure there's momentum so no one ever doubts you. So from the start, we knew we wanted to be at $100 million in 2020. So we were ready to IPO if the investors wanted to get to liquidity.
How did you know that goal was achievable so early?
You don't. You understand that most companies who take external financing don't make it to IPO. Like, I think Series A to IPO, what is it, 5% chance or something like that?
Yeah, certainly less than 10%. Yeah.
So we thought we had a decent shot. And look, if we fail, it'd still be probably a good outcome. It wasn't like if you don't make that, it's a zero. But it would be the only way to stay independent as a company.
A lot of people, when they're talking about why companies don't have any values, why they kind of lack an ethos and they don't stand for anything, they're cowardly, they're weak. A very common refrain is that it's because they're focused on growth at all costs. So again, your story is setting up in every one of these answers to be a kind of company that everyone's like, oh, another tech company that stands for nothing, another tech company will do anything to grow. Because you set your goal in such financial terms. People say, oh, they must have been willing to throw their values overboard, anything to get to the 100 million. So what I'm trying to get you to talk about, and I think this is very typical of mission-driven entrepreneurs, by the way, is that to you, it seems like no big deal. Like, how else would you do it? So you don't even really know what I'm asking. You see what I'm saying? Like, from the outsider's perspective, this story doesn't make sense. It's like, why, if you had the same setup as everybody else, like, why did you wind up doing things differently? So maybe, like, can you pick one of the company values that you've been really committed to, open source or transparency? Like, I feel like GitLab is really known for certain of these principles, remote work. That's probably the most common ones that I hear when I ask people about GitLab. Like, any one of those could easily have been sacrificed on the altar of expediency and kind of getting a short-term revenue boost, or just, trying to get to the IPO sooner. Tell us about a time when you had to make the harder choice.
I don't think that, maybe sometimes compromising on your values will help in the short term, but it's like the really short term. We're talking months, 1-2 years. We've always had goals that extend far beyond that. So if there was, I don't know, you're right. It didn't occur to me to trade off values for a revenue goal because it's not a trade-off. I believe that values themselves are a trade-off. Values are not like, we want to be a company that's, I don't know, positive thing 1, positive thing 2, positive thing 3. Work hard, be smart. Like, that's not a value. A value is an explicit trade-off. And it kind of means that for many values, the exact opposite thing should be a good value too. For example, at GitLab, we pride ourselves on transparency. At the time we were growing, the #1 company on the world, Apple was known for being one of the most secretive companies. It worked
Absolutely.
really, really well for them. So it's not that secrecy or transparency that one of them is better than the other. It's just a trade-off, a decision you're making. And it's kind of it enables distributed decision-making. Who are we going to hire? What are we going to prioritize in the company? And it prevents a lot of infighting. Yeah, at Apple, they keep it a secret what it is until they publish it. At GitLab, we're open from whenever we can by default. It prevents a whole lot of misalignment within the company. I think that's the value. It's not a trade-off with revenue. It's a trade-off with the alternative value.
When did you first realize that you were going to take such an extreme transparency view?
It happened over time. I think the handbook came into existence when I hired, I think it was our 9th or 10th employee, and I was doing the onboard. And we just set a long-term goal, right? We want to be at $100 million in 2020. And it means about 1,000 people as well. And I'm like, wow, I'm training employee number 10. I will have to do this 990 more times, not accounting for attrition in the meantime. I'm like, that sounds pretty miserable. I better start writing down stuff. And then it's like, okay, as a company, we've always prioritized keeping aligned with the wider community. You see a lot of times when a company becomes dominant in a project that the wider open source community kind of retreats because there's this black box that they don't know the intention of or the functioning of. They don't even know who's responsible for what and what the plans are.
Yeah. So how can you trust them?
How can you trust them? How can you collaborate with them? To this day, you can find for any engineering team at GitLab who works there and what they do, and what their handle is, so you can approach them. So that's the transparency started to collaborate with the wider community around GitLab. And it worked. Every single year, the number of contributions kept growing. Then later on, it became a way to recruit people. So many companies say, oh, you got to really be bought into how we work here. But they don't even tell you how they work. It's like,
so how can you be bought into it? Yeah.
Yeah. Join us. We'll tell you how we work and then sign up for that, please. It doesn't make any sense. So it became a great recruiting tool. And then the third wave that came after that was a way to get our users and customers feeling good about the company. We've had financial services companies say, hey, look, I have this trade-off. You have competition. There's alternatives on the market. But I feel like I can trust you more. I know better what's going on, and we'll have a better partnership because of your transparency.
So let's talk about the handbook, because we've had other people on the show who have done a handbook, like Duolingo published their handbook very recently. And there's companies, I think I still think today it's still considered a really underrated strategy, as you say, to communicate internally and externally what your ethos is. And for the people that don't know, like a corporate ethos is like, it's not about the vision or the strategy. It's like the way that the company gets things done. So, the company may pivot, you may change what products you make, but the ethos is consistent. And that's what you have to have if you wish to be a trustworthy counterparty. As you say, if we don't know how you're going to go about things, then we don't know if you're going to choose to betray us or not. But when we talk about the GitLab handbook, this is a very different beast. Even like there's a lot of famous handbooks out there, like the Netflix Culture Code or something like that. First of all, the handbook is huge. It's like 2,000 pages. But the thing that really struck me as interesting about it is that it's live. It's the actual place where your live decisions and policies are communicated to your own employees. And all those documents are just public. I gotta think that a lot of corporate executives, if they're listening to this right now, are like doing a double take. Like, what did he just say? How can you spill that dirty laundry and have people see the details of your decision-making process? Like, I think most people would find that terrifying. So like, this is like the handbook to end all handbooks. So like, how did it come about? How did you decide to take it to that level?
We started very small, and then I think where most handbooks kind of end is when they become outdated. And then at some point, most of it is no longer relevant, and someone just forgot to update it. And then most of it gets cold, and it becomes more of a 12-pager about your values or something like that. Just an introduction to them. At GitLab, it truly is the operating system of the company. Like, I realized at one point I was transitioning from programming in Ruby to programming in English.
Mm-hmm.
The value of GitLab doesn't come from the handbook, like the operating system. It comes from kind of the people within it making really good decisions every single day. The way that you structure those decisions and kind of the guidelines you give people and how we communicate, that's in the handbook. And the trick to keeping it up to date is that everything that is, if you want to change something that's in the handbook, the only way to communicate it is with a change in the handbook. If you allow people to send an email or a PowerPoint or a memo or a Slack message with an update to stuff that's in the handbook, it's going to get out of date. No one's going to go back and later change the handbook.
No, certainly not.
And in fact, that email or Slack message is not going to consider everything that's relevant because you're forced to update it in the handbook. You see all the context and you're forced to change any adjoining procedures or any adjoining information.
Give us an example of how that works in practice.
It works in practice that someone sends a Slack message saying, hey, from now on, let's see that. I'm just going to click some random links. The enterprise data team, what do they do? From now on, the operation analyst will report to the finance department. Suppose that's a thing. You can have a Slack message. If that Slack message does not contain a link to the update in the handbook, someone hopefully will say, hey, can you work handbook first? The handbook is the first place we change things. Because we know if it's the second or third or fourth place,
it'll never get done.
It will never get done because people are busy and we get it. So just change it in the handbook and just communicate that change.
How do you enforce that rule?
That starts at the top of the company.
Do you have an onboarding process to teach people like the way that you work other than just having them read the handbook?
Yeah, we have an onboarding process and it has about 100 items that we'd like you to kind of consume. 100, typically a page in the handbook or another task that we want you to complete. And it's all structured as a GitLab issue with a lot of checkboxes for you to.
What a great dog fooding example.
Yeah.
So, okay, but I want to press you on this because I know a lot of companies that start out with something distinctive like this as part of their philosophy, their ethos. And then they go hire some big time executive from wherever. And, you know, they get a head of marketing from a big company or some head of sales, like it's somebody who's like really a senior person who's like, sorry, I don't work that way. I work in PowerPoint. Or like, no, when I tell my team to do something, I don't have time to go write it in the handbook. Like I do it my way. I'm sure you've encountered that kind of issue. So like a lot of companies fold the first time they have a kind of a heavyweight person like that come in and just be like, sorry, kids, that's not how it's done. Have you encountered that and how did you overcome it?
We certainly encountered that, and that's why it's important that it has strong support, both from all sides. So from the manager of that person, the CEO, the peers, the other executives saying, hey, yeah, I was new to this too. It really works really well. Please try it first before, and otherwise we can talk about changing it. And from the team members, the rest of the team that kind of expects it to go that way.
One of the concepts that I've talked a lot about is this idea of a culture bank. It's an idea that originates with Howard Schultz, who called it the reservoir of trust. Basically, like when you're building a company, in order to be trustworthy, people have to trust that they can predict what you're going to do in various circumstances. And by default, most companies are selfish, even really to the point of being sociopathic. So like if they can get away with doing something, they will. And so to counteract that, you have to build up this currency, this trust currency. And what you're describing is like such a great example. So you say like, think of it like a bank account or a reservoir where whenever you do the right thing in line with your ethos, in line with your values, that's like making a deposit, especially if it comes at some sacrifice or cost. So here you have a big time executive who says, yes, I know it's inconvenient to you to change how you work, But by doing so, you're making a deposit in the bank. And if you allow that kind of behavior to slide, you say, well, this guy gets to be an exception to the policy for some reason. That's like making a withdrawal from the bank. Does that metaphor resonate with you, that it's like a currency, an asset that you have to protect and husband as you grow?
For sure. And you also got to be fair. Like making a change in the handbook is going to be more tedious than a PowerPoint, but it's going to be easier for other people to consume it. It's going to be better thought out, and you won't have to keep reinforcing it all the time because there's 3,000 pages in the handbook. Like no one's going to sit through that. Like that's probably 6,000 PowerPoints. Like no one's going to consume that. So instead of having to make the change over and over and over again over time, you make it one time, and then people can find the relevant information really quickly later down the line.
Do you ever run into the problem where someone goes and makes an obscure change to the handbook, doesn't tell anybody, and then starts trying to like enforce, hold people accountable for following some rule that they just randomly added to the handbook?
A little bit. One thing what we said is like, hey, you don't have to know the handbook. The handbook is not here as like, we expect you to know 3,000 pages. The handbook is here as a reference. If you know that there's a better way to do something, you can just say, hey, look here. There's a better way to do what you just did, and it's over here. And it's not like, oh, you did it wrong and that's super bad. It's just a quick way to guide people to a common way of doing something. And it's not the end of the world. It's not always followed. A little bit of experimentation is also good. Maybe there's a better way than the old one. So the goal certainly is not 100% adherence to the handbook, just that it's up to date. That's the only goal. And I loved your idea of a culture bank. And I think the predictability is super important. We've seen that the most, I think, when pricing different features. Like GitLab is an open core project. So some of the functionality is open source and freely available, and some of it is proprietary. Now, our proprietary features, you can still see the source code, you can contribute to it, you can modify it. If you want to use it, you got to pay us a subscription. In the beginning, there was a lot of like anxiousness around, hey, this new feature, where is it going to land? Is it going to be free or paid? Free or paid? And it required a lot of mental overhead. And we, over time, through a lot of trial and error, we invented a new model called buyer-based open core. Based on
buyer-based open core.
Yeah, based on who the buyer is, who cares most about the feature, we're going to put it in a certain tier. If it's an individual contributor, it's open source. If it's a manager, it's in our lowest tier. If it's an executive who cares most about the feature, it's in our highest paid tier. And that worked remarkably well after trying the other 7 methods of trying to.
I love how simple it is too. That seems like a very easy plan to teach people.
It is simple. Now, it's not that you can say 100% sure. Is this more a manager or a director feature or something like that?
Sure. I'm sure there's still some ambiguity.
It helped greatly in making us more predictable and earning a lot more trust over time.
I got to ask you about Lean Startup because, of course, one of the things people struggle with a lot when they're scaling up a startup and building a handbook, and that is getting people to adopt that kind of entrepreneurial way of thinking, that founder mindset, build MVPs, to be willing to pivot, all that stuff, like to teach that to the entrepreneurs that work for them. What's that been like?
Incredibly hard. So I'm very grateful for all the publicity you did. And actually, I ran into it today. Today, literally, I had a conversation about like, hey, we discussed changes to the website yesterday to make sure it's ready to launch today. You didn't make the changes. And they were like, no, because we got to understand the entire problem. And we made this 5 new documents describing the entire problem space without making actual decisions. And it is so hard to get across that, you know what? It's really hard for people when they read a document to have a feeling about it. But it's really easy for people when they go to a website to buy a product to think through, what should this drop down do? What should this pricing page say? That is so much easier for people to think through. So please, instead of these 5 documents, make the changes to the website so that at least we all align on that, because that is our product, not what's in the document. No one's going to update that document ever. The website is who we are. It's going to be our messaging internally to the people we hire, to our customers, to our partners. They are all going to look at that. No one's going to look at that document. It's not obvious. I had in total, an hour-long discussion with someone today who's never seen startups before. And I'm not sure they were convinced at the end of the conversation. I
Wow.
should send your book.
Yeah, well, I've done what I could, but I think that's very honest. I think it's true. Like this is a very counterintuitive problem. I mean, it goes all the way back to lean manufacturing, trying to teach people to work in smaller batch sizes. There's something about the waterfall style of planning and development that a lot of people find intuitive, even though the evidence is, massive that it doesn't work nearly as well. So I guess, yeah, we're still fighting those battles. That's interesting.
It feels less risky to do waterfall, because those documents, if you got them wrong, you can change them. This website, they know it's going live in a day or two. So it is so much easier to do something in a playground than for real, and it puts the bar higher. With our handbook too, like it's visible to the entire world. That's a high bar, and it takes a while for people to get comfortable with that.
It's interesting because in a lot of companies, they have a rule that says, like, before you make a decision, think about what this would look like if it was on the front page of the New York Times or something like that. Like, as if like internalizing what it would look like if it was publicized, like that would help you figure out if something is good or bad. But what's so funny about that, I always thought, such bad advice, because it centers the publicity angle as the reason to do the right thing. Because someone can be like, oh, well, that's not going to happen because we're going to get away with it. It's like there's this giant loophole right there up front and center. And of course, the fact is most things never are publicized. So people don't actually have very good intuition for what happens if you publicize something that they're doing. What's so interesting to me about the handbook, and especially about the aspect of the handbook that I find so intriguing, that your actual internal deliberations are also part of it. So things don't have to be perfect and finished, and like you're never going to change it again to put it in the handbook. You actually would prefer it just, as you say, just have it be up to date is the main requirement. What I find so interesting about that is you're actually forcing people to practice, like all day, every day, the experience of putting what they're actually doing out into the world to see what that's like. And I'm sure there's been times when somebody made a mistake or they did something the community reacted negatively to. Like, talk about the lessons people learn from actually getting over their fear, being willing to put the thing out into the world, and then like living with the consequence. I'm sure most of the time, nobody cares. So it's actually like very anticlimactic, but you still have to overcome their fear. But I'm sure you also could tell us stories about times when it didn't go that well. There was a backlash or people were upset. Like, what's that been like?
Many, many changes. And one in every 10,000, one in every 100,000 is controversial. And it's with things that are very core to people's identity. And so things that have to do with politics and geopolitics are lightning rods for criticism. And it's one of the few things where it's really hard to share the internal deliberation. So sometimes we opted out of that just because just like in politics, you can have reasonable people and have a reasonable argument, and the people might vocally disagree about it. Most of a company, however, is like programming. DHH is famous for saying you can have a lot of architecture debates, but if you show the two code options to a couple of programmers, most of the time they will agree what the superior code is. For businesses, 99.999% of the cases is like that. And it's fine to share your reasoning. And it's going to help the person who's changing that same line in the future and wonder why it is the way it is.
Leaving politics aside, have you ever had a situation where like you made a change that was controversial with the community, or where there was some kind of unexpected backlash, in the business, or, with your customers or something? Tell me about how you navigated a situation like that.
I think we've probably had many cases. The geopolitics really stand out, where kind kind of the splitting from kind of the West from China has been,
I'm sure, very difficult.
Hard thing for us. We pride ourselves to being very inclusive. Our mission at GitLab is everyone can contribute. So it's really hard to then draw these lines in the sand, but very necessary for GitLab Inc. as a company to do well.
What about going back to the trustworthiness theme? Tell me about GitLab is pretty big now. So when it was only 50 people, it's like at a certain size, there's all this founder mode discourse. Like a certain size, a company, you can by force of will as the individual founder make sure everybody does things in accordance with your ethos. So you just be like, look, my philosophy is this. Everybody has to do it this way. I'm going to monitor everyone, make sure they do it. But once you cross a certain size, and you're certainly well past that size now, it's not possible. You have people every day making decisions on behalf of GitLab. And in fact, in this case, publicizing them probably in a lot of cases before you even know about it, because if they're handbook first and the handbook is public, you're going to find out about a lot of things the company does because you're going to read about it in the handbook, same as everybody else. And that concludes your customers. So a lot of founders I talk to have a lot of anxiety about, how do I know that people will make the trustworthy decision? How have you helped the organization align around that as a goal and something to take seriously and to something to kind of never compromise on?
I've certainly not been perfect, but I'm not sure I agree with the premise. Founder Mode, the article, I think, was inspired by Brian Chesky of Airbnb. After the pandemic, Airbnb has currently, they've recovered 7,000 employees, but maybe they were 5,000 when he went full Founder Mode. So Founder Mode is possible at scale. And of course, you don't control every single action, but as a founder, the actions you take and the things you highlight and the changes you request will reverberate throughout the company and will have a huge impact.
Oh, sure. I didn't mean to imply other words. And certainly, Brian's example is very famous. What I meant is more like, no matter how founder mode you go, and no matter how much of a micromanager you are, and no matter how in the details you are, the scope of your influence is necessarily limited to the people that you can personally interact with. And more importantly, I think by the information you're capable of consuming as an individual person.
Sure.
Nobody can know everything. So I want to know about the alignment efforts you've made to make sure that when you're not there, looking over somebody's shoulder, you still have confidence they're going to do things the GitLab way.
That is an incredibly hard problem, and I've certainly not solved that. One thing we've done is to reinforce our values in as many ways as possible. Many companies say that their values are really important to them, but then you ask, how many ways do you have to reinforce them? And you can name about 3 of them. At GitLab, we have 22 ways to reinforce our values, from really essential ones, like how we hire, how we give performance bonuses, to really trivial ones that the songs in the GitLab songbook reference our values a lot. But I think it's a great strength to reinforce your values in so many ways that they become more top of mind for people, and hopefully people involve them in more of their decisions.
Have you published this list of the 22 ways? Is that you referencing something that we can link to?
Yeah, for sure. If you Google reinforce values GitLab, you'll get to the GitLab values page, and then you look for reinforce. How do we reinforce our values? You'll find the list.
Oh, you may have a list. This is so cool. I didn't see this when I looked at this before. Can I just read this list?
For sure.
Okay, I'm gonna read. Okay. Listen, I'm going to read this whole list because I think this is really cool, and because I work with so many companies that, as you say, they say they value something, and they're like Enron, man. Remember Enron collapsed? They had their values etched in marble in the lobby. It's like integrity. Be honest and ethical. It's right there on the wall, and yet they were a total fraud and they totally collapsed. So many people, I think, are really inadequate to this task. So I'm just going to read some of these, and after I read them all, I want you to reflect on what's been your process of actually really matching your conviction to this level of investment in maintaining your values. So here we go. So criteria for promotions, who you select for during hiring, absolutely. What you emphasize on onboarding, annual compensation review, what you make sure you refer to them when making decisions. I really like that you do emphasize that a fish rots from the head down. So of course, as a leadership team, you have to embody it. You have an expectation that all the team members will be ambassadors of your values. You keep them up to date. You give each other 360 feedback. You compliment people who are in line with your values. You use the same criteria for discretionary bonuses. You include it in your offer letters. You use it to manage underperformance. You decide when you let people go. You give value awards during your summit. You have the CEO shadow program, which I won't describe that. I'll let you describe that in a second. You link the takeaways of courses to your values, like you did for the Crucial Conversations training. So whenever you do a training, it's related to the values. You make sure it's in the default settings of the software you use, which I think that's a really surprising one and really interesting. You reinforce the values with your own features in GitLab. You apply them as the values virtual background in video calls, which it's so great. It's, as you've mentioned, it's already in the GitLab songbook, which mention the values, and you regularly conduct the values exercise at the e-group offsite. That's 22 ways to reinforce your values. And I want to ask you about it because most companies I know at most do 5 of those things. I'd be very impressed if they did 10, all 22. It's such a comprehensive list. It's, as you say, things large and small. It really gives the impression of somebody who's trying to do everything they can think of to reinforce. So talk to me about the development of that list. When did you realize how big a commitment this was going to require to accomplish? And when did these elements come into play?
I think when I realized we had many more ways to reinforce them already than most companies I talk to, maybe it became a little bit of a background process in my mind to always look for that opportunity, even if it was maybe a little bit trivial, like the songbook. But some of them are so impactful. Every time we promote someone in the company, there's a document shared with the entire company, why this person was promoted. And the main structure of it is according to our values. That's the headers, our 6 values. Because basically promotions are what behavior you reward in a company. So that is the number one thing to nail, to make sure that people see, okay, these people got rewarded for acting according to our values. There's so many things. You mentioned the default setting of the software we use. We want efficiency. We want meetings to start on time. That means they have to end on time. That means I need a bio break in between. That means 25-minute meetings. That means all the software at GitLab that we can configure so that it's 25 minutes. We have documents open to at least the company by default. We configure the software to do that.
Yes, you have to make extra work to create a secret document.
Exactly. And we have a whole team that watches, that makes sure that there's all the secrets we're expected to keep, especially for our customers, that we don't make mistakes there, and that helps as well. I think they mentioned something about updating the values. I can't find how often we update the values, but we talked about updating the handbook. In the last 7 hours, there were more than 20 changes to our handbook. So just in the span of a single time zone workday, we keep trying to keep it up to date. I think I've always watched kind of the history of the values page. How often are the operating principles below the values updated? Because if your values are not changing and the interpretation of it are not changing, they are not alive, and you are not practicing your values. If you're practicing, they are changing, and that's why every value, apart from a big shiny word, has a lot of operating principles that explain what they mean to us and how we do them.
When you do your performance reviews, I notice performance reviews come up a lot here. Do you have a process for making sure that when you encounter novel situations in someone's performance review, or when someone did a really good job embodying one of the values, does that make its way back into the handbook?
There's not a process for that. I think we do look at how much people are contributing to the handbook as part of the performance review. Like typically our strong performers also have a lot of changes and improvements.
A lot of commits to the handbook.
Yep.
Got it. One thing that is not on this list that I was surprised, and maybe I just it's under one of these operating principles in a way I didn't pick up on, is budgeting. Like when you do budgeting exercise and decide how resources are allocated, surely that must also be driven by the values.
I see it as something orthogonal. Like we don't have a values department. We don't have the efficiency department. These are things that every department is supposed to do and every individual is supposed to do. So I don't see it as allocating $100,000 to collaboration. I don't think that makes sense.
Yeah. I was thinking more like if a product manager comes to you and said, listen, I want to go work on this project or this product. I want to take a team of 5 for 6 months and go do this thing. There's a lot of discretion about who's allowed to do that and when. Excuse me. A lot of discretion about who gets to do that and when. And I'm just curious if it's part of your criteria to say, okay, the people who are the most values aligned are the ones who get those assignments or kind of have a little bit more discretion than others. Because I think that's a common thing we see in business. People say, well, I'm a high performer. I get the goods, I get the job done, whether I follow the values or not. And so I get rewarded. I get to do the stuff because I have this performance capability. And I think a lot of organizations struggle, although you were very explicit here that you guys will let such a person go. A lot of companies struggle to let that person go because they're so focused on performance, they actually can't see the forest for the trees, and they wind up, sacrificing the long-term performance for the short term.
There's a couple of ways in which people get more discretion, but one of the main ways is their title. Especially in engineering, we have a dual career track as an IC. You can make progress, and the higher you get as an individual contributor engineer, the more discretion you have over your time. And those promotions happen according to our values. So hopefully those people also represent our values the best.
Have you ever had a situation where someone claimed that they couldn't do their job or their performance was being inhibited by your values and requested the values be changed or waived on that basis?
For sure. There's a lot of conflict between values. And I think we're one of the few companies that say, even our top 6 values, we have an explicit hierarchy within them. So we say, hey, results for customers is our number 1 value. If we have to sacrifice transparency to get results for customers.
Yeah, you gave us an example of that already.
Yeah, we will do so. And I think a lot of companies are not explicitly addressing that. And it for us, although it's not an exact science, it really helped to say, hey, results for customers is number 1. On the second level is iteration and transparency. On the third level is collaboration, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and efficiency. So, of course, the magnitude matters, but if we have to choose between transparency and efficiency, we'll choose efficiency. But if we choose between iteration and results for customers, we'll choose the results for customers.
Well, and in particular, I would think efficiency and results for customers is the thing that trips a lot of companies up, where they say, wait a minute, we could screw our customers over in a way that would make things much more efficient for us very easily, and we make a quick dollar. And that's how, Cory Doctorow even coined the term shitification to describe this process of products being made materially worse over time because they have this wrong trade-off embedded in their heart. So I think that's really smart to be explicit about the hierarchy.
Thank you.
So one of the aspirations that I have in companies that I've helped build is this decentralized decision-making. I sometimes even call it management without managers. And that doesn't mean like don't ever hire managers. It means that there's this vast universe of decisions that people have to make autonomously. And if they always have to run back to a manager to find out what to do, the communication overhead is way too high to do anything fast in that universe. But also, my experience is that decisions get watered down the more levels they have to get checked with. So if someone wants to do something bold, something exciting, something creative, if they have to go get 25 approvals, by the time they've got the 25th approval, even if every person they talk to says yes, the idea will be materially worse and always in the same direction. It'll be more conventional, more boring, more consensus. And so you miss out on a lot of things. And I'm curious if that idea resonates with you, the idea that having the handbook and having these 22 ways of enforcing the values, like part of what you're doing is allowing people to make managerial type decisions without having to check with a manager.
For sure. I think one of the things that I realized at GitLab that I think is extremely powerful is that you don't have to trade off hierarchical decision-making and consensus decision-making. And I think this is a very common misconception. There are companies that are hierarchical and they are faster, but make worse decisions. And there's companies that are consensus. And they make better decisions, but they make them slower. It is a false dichotomy. You don't have to pick. You need to separate the two phases of making a decision. The first phase is gathering information, telling people you're making a decision, and asking for data points. The second phase of making the decision is actually making it. In that case, do it hierarchical. The person who's going to do the work should decide, not their boss. The person doing the work, the person accountable for the end result makes it. And that person doesn't have to explain to anyone why they made the decision. They don't have to respond to anybody's data points or feedback or suggestions. The only thing they have to do is they have to read all the suggestions. They have to listen, but they don't have to acknowledge anybody. And at GitLab, one of our operating principles is short toes. We will give suggestions. You got to live with the fact that people will very frequently not take them and that they won't explain themselves. That is the cost of being able to provide your input. Because if you make people respond to the input and explain themselves, the thing that's going to happen is they will fly decisions under the radar. Because the more people know about the decision, the more people will provide input, the more work I have. And I think with that, we've been able to separate those two parts and been able to combine the best of consensus organizations, having a ton of input, and of hierarchical organizations, having a quick decision by the most important person for the end result, namely the person doing the work.
Yeah. Gosh, I want to just do this all day. I feel like these are really interesting elements of a management philosophy that I think most companies could adopt if they had the courage to do so. And what I think is so interesting about it is it seems to me like a key part of the story here is that you started so early, realizing that like onboarding, was going to require you to do something in a repeated way instead of just doing it bespoke by hand. So can you talk about that journey? I think if I could get entrepreneurs to do one thing, in this area, this is definitely be the thing I would choose, like to start this whole process much sooner and to see it, as you say, like programming the organization is as important as programming the product. Building the product, you're building the organization. It's the most important product you'll ever make in your life.
Maybe an additional argument why it's super helpful to have a public handbook. What's the most important thing in your company? It's your people, because your people change the processes and they produce the product. What's the most important thing? Of course, retention is super important, but mostly recruiting. Can you attract the right people? A public handbook is an amazing recruiting tool. So many people join GitLab and say, hey, you know what? At our department, I was referencing the GitLab handbook many, many, many times. And now that the time has come for me to make a career change, I'm like, I'm just going to work at the place that actually writes the stuff that I'm referencing the whole time. Because, well, what's better than working there? Because I think you're right about a lot. Also, I have some ideas about some changes. Some stuff doesn't add up. I'm going to change that on my first day. And we're like, you didn't have to wait. You can contribute to the handbook.
On your first day, absolutely. I love that.
So you can, before you work at GitLab, you can make a suggestion and we'll review it. But it's an amazing recruiting tool. And it gets people who are really, really motivated, but also aligned. And just like values, transparency can be good, secrecy can be good. Not everything at GitLab is necessarily the only right way. It's our way. And due to the handbook, we find people who align with that.
It's such an underrated superpower. On podcasts for a while now, I've been calling it, the principle is called harder is easier. Because what's so interesting to me about all these practices that you're describing, like there's thousands of pages in the handbook and all this extra work, and you had to write the stuff down, and you got to publish the thing, and you got to deal with the conflict. You've described all this extra work that you've had to do over the years. And I know a lot of people would say, gosh, business is already so hard. Now Sid's making me do all this extra work. And it's like, no, man, you have it backwards. If you do the extra work, so many of the most difficult problems that everyone complains about become super easy. Not easy, but at least easier. And recruiting, I mean, how many companies are complaining about their ability to recruit? Having a superpower of recruiting, a superpower of communication and alignment and decentralized decision-making, those superpowers are really worth a lot. And they're worth the extra work necessary to go down this path. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, for sure. It is extra work. It is extra pain. And it pays off. The pain is immediate and it pays off cumulative, if I could pronounce the word. It pays off over time. That's why we use an alternative word. It pays off over time. So are you running the company for a year or for 10 years? Like if you're running it for a year, please don't start a handbook. Just focus on the year. You want to be there a long time? Probably start making a handbook.
That's really great. You're a public company now and have been for a little while. A lot of CEOs find being a public company is difficult to maintain their distinctive ethos, difficult to think long-term. Now, you had the advantage of governance protections and a very aligned cap table, which I'm sure it was helpful in this process. But what's it been like watching the company navigate being public and taking in input now, not just from your community, not just from your customers, but from public market investors?
There's a whole lot that comes with that. And I'm very, very grateful, especially to our G&A leaders, finance people, legal, who've helped us kind of grow up and deal with that successfully. I think the value that was most at risk at GitLab when transitioning to be public was transparency. And it's interesting because a public company means that you're forced to be transparent about some things that you didn't have to be about before. For example, finances. Yeah. Finances at GitLab were not transparent before. But at GitLab, so many other things were transparent that no other company in the world was doing. That there was a thinking like maybe we should stop with all that because it's a whole lot of additional risk. And I'm very grateful to our legal department and especially Robin, our chief legal officer, who said, you know what? I think we can do it. I think we can keep the vast majority of our transparency without incurring additional risk. And she and her department did an awesome job there, up to the point that they had a bug bounty out. Like if you found something that would get us in trouble as a public company, they would pay you to find it so that they were aware of it. And in the end, very, very few things needed to be removed. Some things needed to be clarified, but we were able to go public with the vast majority of our transparency intact and even some additional transparency in the form of finances.
That's super cool. And that reflects a leader in your organization who's willing to think from first principles, because there's no copy paste solution there to say, well, they did it that way. And I just think a lot of compliance folks, like they just have such a knee-jerk risk aversion that if you say, I want to do something different, they're like, oh, no, sorry, you got to do it the cookie cutter way. And that would have been, I mean, like what a tragedy, I think, for this company to have gone through the going public process and wound up cookie cutter like everybody else. That would have been really sad. So kudos to them for having that first principle thinking, and kudos to you for building a company where that kind of thinking can thrive.
Yeah, you got to be lucky. If people are really a master of their craft, they can think from first principles instead of copying what they did in their last job.
Good thing you had an extraordinary recruiting advantage.
If you ask Robin, one of her proudest things is the SAFE framework she implemented at GitLab and trained everyone in to prevent any problems with the transparency. And to this date, I can't remember something that went sideways.
Do you think another thing I've heard from people along the lines of this harder is easier kind of kick that I've been on is that one of the superpowers, in addition to attracting talent, it also attracts a different kind of investor. And it strikes me that you, even as a public company, you've had this really positive experience and these very long-term investors who you've had this really positive partnership with. That's actually relatively rare among public companies. And I wonder if you attribute that also to the fact that you're getting the same kinds of self-selection into your stock with, you know, your ethos and the handbook and standing for what you do that you get with employees and with customers.
I'm not sure. Also because I'm no longer running it, but I've ran only one public company, so I don't have comparison.
You don't know what to compare it to. Yeah.
I do think that a lot of investors were very much intrigued by our transparency, and a lot of investors spent late nights before the first meeting we had, kind of going into our handbook like the first time you explore Wikipedia, and you just get sucked into it and you keep clicking on links, and before you know it, it's 2 a.m. in the morning. So certainly that effect was present.
Let's talk about being all remote. That's another thing that, you know, since the pandemic, I think there's been a little bit more of an understanding of how it's possible to build a remote company. But there's also been, as you know, I'm sure you're aware, a pretty significant backlash against having remote workers. You've been all remote, I think, from inception, right? You've always been all remote and always open source. Talk about what that's been like to kind of be a pioneer in that way as well.
It was kind of 3 phases in our remote journey. In the beginning, it was very much against consensus. When we did Y Combinator, they said, look, companies have managed to be all remote with their engineering departments, but not other departments. So rent a space, build a headquarters, and it's okay for your engineers to be remote. So we did it. We signed an office lease, and we did as instructed. And I think that was very good advice. But we discovered after like half a year that people would stop showing up in the headquarters because they didn't like the long commute. And we made it so that they didn't need to be in the office to do their work. They were not missing out on.
Explain missing out, because I think that's a really key. I've heard you explain that other times. I think it's a really key thing for people to understand why in a lot of companies, remote work doesn't work because people are missing out. What does that mean?
I compare it to, in normal companies, you have a headquarters and then all the satellite offices. And if you're at a satellite office, you're going to miss out on information, on career opportunities, on visibility in front of management. You're going to miss out on gossip, on informal communication. You're going to miss out on feeling the company. And because of that, you want to be in the headquarters as fast as possible. If you're in Procter & Gamble, the Netherlands, you better try to get to Geneva. And if you're in Geneva, you probably want to go to the US. At GitLab, because we didn't have an HQ, everyone was on the same level. But it wasn't effortless. We do a ton of things to facilitate informal communication, to make sure that people form connections on an informal level outside of the direct work topics. And we work really, really hard on that. And it doesn't happen naturally. Now, people commute for like half an hour a day. There is time. You can require people to spend some time to do that. And your HR department doesn't have to do facilities, and you spend 10% less on office buildings. There's money and time to do that, but you got to organize it. Also, there was skepticism in the investment community. One investor said, GitLab meets all my criteria. This person was the best investor in the world at the time we were talking with him, and probably still is. And he's like, but this remote thing, I'm not saying it doesn't work. It's just a risk, and I don't need to take that risk. And that was a very sad moment. And there was a moment when the board said, hey, look, you've raised now. You got a new round. You got money in the bank. Get a decent office. Like, what is this thing? Because we were only using it to host a board meeting. And they said it doesn't even look like an office. So get a bigger space. And I'm like, shit, that's going to be $5,000 a month. I'm like, okay, give me one shot. I'm going to spend a one-time $5,000 instead of a month, and I'm going to make it look like an office. And I went out, bought the biggest monitors I could find, 65-inch, put them three wide, too high. And then when you went into the office, I put them on full brightness. It was a solar studio with all our dashboards. And somehow investors believe that if you display your ARR on a big monitor and next to it, your gross margin and everything else, you pay more attention to it. Maybe it's true, maybe not, but it definitely worked and we didn't have to get a bigger office. Then the pandemic hit. Really, it was phase 2 because we thought we needed to do all these things to be effective as a remote company. Turns out you didn't need to do any of that. You just give people Zoom and Slack and it works. And then the pandemic ended and people went back to the office because they were missing that informal communication. And we're like, okay, turns out all the extra stuff we were doing and pushing on, it is necessary. And if you don't do that, you cannot sustain remote for a long time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the companies that have had issues with remote, it's because they didn't make that extra effort to do those things. And as you say, then people start missing out and then it creates all these weird dynamics.
For sure. And of course they didn't because they started doing remote in one day and it worked amazingly well. So there was no signal to them that they had to do it. We only did it because everyone told us for 10 years it didn't work.
Yeah, well, that's another classic reservoir of trust situation is that if you've worked in person for a long time, you build up all this reservoir of relation. You're drawing down your balance, during the pandemic, and people said, oh, well, I guess it's like classic, like I cut the forest down and nothing bad happened. I made all this money cutting the forest down. I guess it's fine. It's like, well, that's not sustainable. Eventually, you're gonna run out of trees to cut down. You got to replant. So I think that's exactly. That's wise.
And to this day, when we form a new team, we allow them to get together in person because some things are really good in person and really helps for high bandwidth communication and getting to know each other. So when there's a state of flux, a new team or a big change, it doesn't make sense to bring people together in person.
And it's more like a fun vacation then. It's not like, oh, I'm being dragged into the office.
Well, it's certainly hard work and we schedule it not full of PowerPoints that you got to sit through, but full of activities to get to know people. And it's certainly not vacation. It's extremely expensive and a lot is expected of people, but we do focus on the informal communication on events like that because the work we can get done while we're remote. That's not needed. And a presentation you can watch while we're remote. So we focus on all the other things, the shared experiences and getting to meet new people and hang out with them and break bread together.
Let's talk about open source and open core, because that's another thing that you've never wavered on and has always been part of the business. And yet you were saying, open core involves a certain level of proprietary software. There's plenty of open source and free software people who would say that that's an unacceptable compromise. Like, how did you land on the open core model? And how did how did that become kind of one of the pillars of what the company stands for?
Yeah, we mentioned before, I was really inspired by WordPress, who have managed to keep it completely open source. And that was a bigger inspiration. And we wanted to do the same thing. So the first thing we tried was donations. When I got started, Dimitri called it ice cream money because the $7 a month was enough to buy ice cream for his partner every month. And we got it up to $1,000 a month. But it was very clear it was not sustainable, not in the least, because my wife was making a separate EU VIT invoice for every $5 donation, costing about 20 minutes of time. Then we tried consulting. That worked up to a certain degree because we kept making GitLab better and they didn't need the consulting anymore. Same with kind of a subscription for support. They needed the support. They got a subscription. Year later, they hadn't used it the whole year. They stopped their subscription. We tried the hosting. Just pay for GitLab.com, pay for the service. But the value add was not enough. And we kind of figured out what Silicon Valley has known for a long time. Software is an amazing business model. And it's really hard to do something else than proprietary software. So after trying every single other thing, we concluded, okay, we really need to charge for proprietary features. And then it was figuring out the buyer-based open core model. First, we had different tiers based on company size, and we tried all kinds of things. And we over time, we figured out a few stewardship promises, like we will never put any artificial limits in our open source software. But it turned out that adding proprietary features worked really well. These features were very additional, and people saw that while the proprietary features were growing, the open source features were growing faster than before. Because we could charge money, we could invest more.
Yeah, you have to be trustworthy. You have to show that the shared prosperity that you generate is invested in the things that the community cares about.
Exactly. Is the open source code base growing faster than before, or slower? Or even worse, are you taking away from the open source code base, which is the biggest no-no?
So when I was talking to Matt, I made this claim that I thought I wasn't sure how he would feel about it. But I want to run the same idea by you, because one of the things I've noticed is when I'm a big open source believer from way back. I was like a Free Software Foundation licensing volunteer back in the day, for those who know what that is. So like I've always naturally had an affinity for open source and free software. But I had a very poor track record of convincing people in the companies where I've worked to go open source who weren't already committed to the movement. And I never felt like the arguments, I always struggle making arguments that people would find convincing, because they're always like, well, why should I give this thing away for free? And what's it going to run down to me? And what really changed for me is when I finally started to understand this concept of trustworthiness as an asset. That finally helped me make sense of why open source is so powerful. You're not giving something away for free. You are taking a huge step towards committing yourself to being a trustworthy counterparty to the people in your community. And that is it's a selfless act in the sense that you're giving them something, but it also redounds to your own benefit, because now people can trust you. They can build their business around you. They can use you as a foundation that they can rely on. And I can remember, earlier in my career as an engineer, when it used to be controversial even to use open source software. So it used to be like, database vendors and operating system vendors would say, I don't know, if you use this open source software, like you might take on liability and you might be in trouble with compliance. And I lived through the shift where now, like if someone's like starting a company and they went to Y Combinator and said, we refuse to use open source software, every person would look at them like, what are you talking about? That's completely nuts. I predict in the future, we will go through a similar shift in actually making software open source. It will come to be seen as like kind of irrational to keep everything for yourself selfishly, and then ask people to depend on you in this way that makes it hard to be trusted. And I wonder if you buy into that idea that there's actually a new horizon we can get to with open source, where people will start to see it as a default trust building exercise.
I believe that we will go from a current situation where a lot of software is either completely proprietary or completely open source to open core as the default. Almost all software will have open source parts and proprietary parts. And the mix will depend on the company and how they choose to navigate it. The more open source you have, it's a tailwind in your distribution, in your go-to-market. It's a tailwind in your contributions, your R&D. It's a headwind in your take rate, in your revenue. And that makes sense for parts of your offering and not for other parts. Which parts? That really depends per project, per company. So it's for some companies will only have 5%, some companies 50%, some companies 95%. So it's going to be a spectrum. I think more and more companies are going to be open core, and they're going to make those trade-offs, and they're going to be more thoughtful upfront about which parts are going to be open source so that they are predictable to the wider community.
Before we end, tell me about Open Core Ventures.
With GitLab, I saw the power that a company can have on accelerating an open source project. GitLab, the open source code base, would never be what it is today if there wasn't a company behind it. And I believe that all software is going to be, the vast majority of software is going to be open core in the future. Now, I could go to all the proprietary companies and tell them to open source part of it. You've tried that. You found that extremely hard. I think I'll find that extremely hard as well. The alternative is to go to open source software and build a company around it. And open source, the great thing about it, it's permissionless innovation. I don't need anybody's permission to start a company. So with Open Core Ventures, we don't invest in existing companies. We identify open source projects that we think are very promising, and we build a company around it. We start the company, incorporate it, make sure there's money in the bank, and start hiring people, typically contributors to the project into it. find a CEO, typically someone who's run a company before, who's done Y Combinator, who knows speed. And then we try to steward those companies by helping them with advice and connections. And it's been really, really fulfilling. We've had more than 20 companies started so far, and the pace is accelerating. And some of them are doing really, really well. With OCV, one thing we sometimes address is the concern of people contributing to the open source project that we hire who join in the beginning and say, hey, I want to join the company. I see the benefit. What I'm really afraid of is a relicensing. The current license of the project, something permissive like MIT or BSD. And what I'm afraid of is later on changing the license, like Redis did, like Elasticsearch did. I don't want that to happen. And for a long time, we looked into, okay, what license can we use that prevents that? And the answer is, it's either something not very permissive. I love permissive licenses. I think they're a really good thing. Or you change the company. So the solution isn't in the license, it's in the company. And so some of the companies we start, not the majority of them, but some of them, we start as open charter companies. And in their charter, they explicitly say, hey, we're not going to relicense this project. And because it's in the charter, if they don't act according to it, there's a liability there. And we want to ensure that these companies are predictable and that not at some point in the future, they decide to change the rules of the game. We're proud of that text. It's open. We hope that other new projects will do that, and that it's going to be kind of a badge of honor. Like, I'm using this project and I know there's not going to be a rug pull down the line.
I think that's so important. And I think founders very often miss the chance to really embed what they truly believe into the charter of the company. And they don't make their promises, the promises that they think are the most important to make to their customers, to their community. My view is they should be made in at least as strong a terms as the promises you make to your investors. And so in most companies, you're establishing a fiduciary duty to your investors when you incorporate. Why not also, this is an old Sol Price ism, which is like, why not be a fiduciary to your customer? Why not take on the responsibility to see them as important as your investors? And I think when companies that do that are able to be so much more trustworthy.
I totally agree. It's really hard to nail down the language. In the case of not relicensing the software, that language we feel was easier. But we're very much open to suggestions. What other things make a good open source project? With GitLab, we have stewardship promises that we publish. We've looked at putting those into the charter, but because it's enforceable and anybody can sue you for it, we've not found the language yet. But if there's some legal people out there who see other things we could add to the open charter, we're very much open for contributions.
Well, you should consider a mission trust or a perpetual purpose trust.
These are kind of public benefit companies with the charter language. I think a trust would probably make it much harder to fund the company, but I've not looked into that in detail. So maybe I'm wrong.
We will discuss it. We will discuss it another time. For those that are listening, you know, obviously some companies are entirely owned by a trust or a foundation, and that can have its own issues. But you can also have trustees who just have the responsibility of overseeing some aspect of the company's compliance or mission purpose. So, for example, Anthropic very famously built the Long-Term Benefit Trust, which has stewardship responsibility for their AI safety mission. And the power of the trust is then written into the charter. And it's extremely useful as a mechanism for situations where, with not relicensing, it's very specific. So you can be very, very concrete about what you're promising. With something like AI safety, it's much more difficult to be concrete. We don't exactly know what it is that we're promising, except that we promise to take AI safety seriously. So this allows you to make such a promise without having to be too specific about what exactly you're going to be doing in a way that is nonetheless still credible to outside parties.
You might find very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we could discuss it. We could discuss it another time. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, you've been very public about your cancer diagnosis and the way that has forced you to, to change your relationship to the company. And first of all, I got to ask how you're doing. I don't think there's been a public update in a little while. Like how's that going? And just, is there anything you want to share about how having that experience has changed the way you see business, see the opportunity to do something like this. I feel like that must have been a life-changing experience, but I would love to know what your experience has been like.
Yeah, thank you. I'm doing really well. About half a year ago, my bone cancer recurred. And at that point, there was no more standard of care for me. There were no trials available to me because it's a rare disease. And I needed to figure things out myself. And I've learned that a lot of possible new treatments don't come to market because trials are amazingly expensive, $100 million, and only have a 3% approval rate. So that's like $3 billion per medicine. So things that work in a minority of the patients, they don't get to market. Things that are less likely to work, but where the downsides are lower than the upside, don't get to market.
Yeah.
Things that are better than the alternative, but not better than the investigator's choice, don't get to market. And for myself, I've really driven into this, and I'm now working on a couple of treatments that I think should exist. But I've also become intrigued with the possibility that maybe by more people doing that and by offering some of the things I've learned about diagnostics to other people, we can gain knowledge and bring down the price of these patient-specific offerings, and maybe even use the data in the end to have a lower cost trial with a higher approval chance so that more medicine comes to market.
Well, I really appreciate, as I would expect no less from you, that you found a way to take your private experience and turn it to the public benefit, which I feel like has so much been the ethos of GitLab from the beginning.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and although it's on one hand it's life or death, it's also been a really rewarding experience, and I've started 3 companies so far, and look forward to many, many more.
Well, I wish you the best of luck, not just with that personally, but with the broader mission of trying to make that more accessible to more people. It's incredibly important.
Thanks, Eric.
All right, Sid, thank you very much for everything you've done for open source, for the community at large, and for so many people that your work has touched. And in particular, I wanted to thank you for just being a really inspirational example of an ethos that is committed to human flourishing. And someone who had, you make it sound like no big deal, but I keep being struck by what a commitment it's been for such a long time to really take these things seriously, from the thousands of pages in the handbook to the fact that the values are in the GitLab songbook. Like, so many things, large and small. I think a lot of people listening are going to take a lot of inspiration to say, wait a second, I think I could do that too. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, and I bet they can sing Toto by Africa with our alternative lyrics a lot better than me and the executive team. That's the one time that people stepped in to cut us off. But thanks so much. And thanks for spreading the gospel. Get people starting a startup, get your product live tomorrow. No business plan. And thanks for preaching that. The more companies launch, the better off we all are.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.